The ski resort nestled in the heart of the Rockies had always been a place of escape, a retreat from the chaos of the world. The isolation, the vast snow-covered mountains, and the crisp air offered a sense of peace, a rare kind of tranquility. Beth had always been drawn to such places, places that seemed untouched by time. A weekend getaway with friends was supposed to be a much-needed break from her stressful job in the city. But from the moment she arrived at the resort, something felt off. The first thing Beth noticed was the silence. It was the kind of silence that envelopes you completely, that presses in on your thoughts, almost as if the world around you were holding its breath. The air was frigid, and snowflakes fell in thick, slow motions, blanketing the landscape in a heavy, muffled white. As she and her friends unloaded their bags from the car, she looked up at the resort, an old wooden structure that seemed to blend into the mountainside, like something out of a forgotten era. The lights inside the windows glowed faintly, casting an inviting warmth. But even then, the feeling of stillness hung in the air. Walking inside, they were greeted by the scent of old wood and pine, the kind of smell that made you feel both nostalgic and uneasy at the same time. The lobby was cozy but empty, save for the old man behind the front desk, who nodded to them without a word. Beth didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the isolation of the place getting to her. After all, it was late, and most of the guests had probably already gone to their rooms. But as she walked to the elevators, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond her sight. The resort was unusually quiet for a Friday night, especially considering the ski season was in full swing. There were no sounds of laughter or chatter, no music echoing through the halls. Beth couldn't recall the last time she had been in a place this devoid of life. It felt like she had stepped into a time capsule, preserved in a moment long past. As the group made their way to their room, they passed several empty hallways, their doors closed and still. Not a single person in sight. It was as though the place had been abandoned years ago, only to be slowly revived for the ski season, as if on a whim. When they reached their room, Beth took a moment to look out the window. The snow had intensified, swirling around in a frenetic dance. The night had become thick with it, the world beyond disappearing into the white abyss. She felt a strange, unease settle in her stomach. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled her. It was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. She shook her head, brushing the thought aside. It was probably just the weather playing tricks on her mind. The friends settled in, unpacking their things and chatting about the day ahead. They discussed plans for skiing, hitting the slopes early in the morning before the crowds arrived. But even as they spoke, Beth couldn't shake the sense of disconnection. The more she tried to dismiss it, the more it clung to her, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She glanced toward the door, half expecting someone, or something, to appear there. But the hallway remained empty. The only sounds were the wind howling outside and the occasional creak of the building as it settled. It wasn't until they were all settling into bed that the first oddity occurred. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, nobody moved, as though waiting for the lights to return. But nothing happened. Beth's heart began to race. She fumbled for her phone, using its dim light to search for the lamp switch. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked, her voice strained. Her friends seemed unfazed, each shrugging it off. "It's just the storm," one of them said, turning over to sleep. Beth wasn't convinced. There was something off about the way the building seemed to absorb the light, like the darkness itself had a mind of its own. She glanced once more at the window, seeing nothing but an impenetrable wall of snow. It was then that she noticed something else. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep within the resort. She stood up, straining to listen, but the noise stopped abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, had been walking had vanished. She sat back down, unnerved but unwilling to admit to herself that she was afraid. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just the wind, or maybe someone in the hall." The storm raged outside, but within the confines of the room, the silence resumed its suffocating presence. And for the first time in years, Beth found herself longing for the noise of the city, for the hum of life that she had come to take for granted. But here in the mountain resort, It was just her friends, and the silence. As she lay there in the dark, her mind churned with unanswered questions. What had she heard? Who or what had been walking down the hall? The quiet of the resort had already begun to feel unnatural, almost like a presence in itself, something that wasn't simply the absence of sound. It was something more, and the longer she stayed, the more she could feel it pressing in around her. As the night wore on, Beth tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too alive with unanswered questions. The storm outside continued its fury, but in the resort, it was the silence that truly haunted her. The morning light, pale and weak, filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Beth stirred from a fitful sleep, the events of the previous night still heavy in her mind. She had not been able to shake the sense that something was wrong, that the resort was hiding something beneath its quaint, snow-covered exterior. The storm outside had raged through the night, and the silence of the resort, if anything, had deepened in the absence of wind. The only sound now was the occasional thud of snow piling against the walls of the building. Her friends, seemingly unaware of the tension in the air, were already up and about, talking eagerly about the day ahead. They discussed plans for skiing and heading to the lodge for hot drinks afterward. They didn't seem bothered by the eerie quiet that had filled the halls. But to Beth, the place had a weight to it, a heaviness that settled over her like the thick blanket of snow outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. As they headed downstairs for breakfast, Beth noticed the same oddities that had plagued her the night before. The resort still seemed unnaturally quiet. The dining area, typically bustling with guests on a winter weekend, was almost empty, save for a few elderly couples sitting by the windows, their faces drawn and expressionless. It was as though everyone was intentionally avoiding interaction, retreating into their own worlds. The clink of silverware against plates echoed unnervingly in the otherwise hushed space. Beth tried to push the discomfort aside as she grabbed a coffee, forcing herself to smile and engage with her friends. But when she sat down, she couldn't help but glance at the other guests, their vacant stares unsettling. There was something distant in their eyes, as if they weren't fully present, like the life had been drained from them. It wasn't a look that anyone would expect to see on a vacation. The older man behind the counter, the one who had checked them in the night before, was now standing in the corner, watching them. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving their group. Beth's unease grew. She was about to suggest they leave and head to the slopes when a sudden commotion outside caught her attention. A group of skiers, bundled in brightly colored coats, was trudging back into the resort, their faces flushed from the cold. But there was something off about them. They moved in unison, as if pulled by some invisible force, their movements stiff and mechanical. Beth blinked, unsure if it was the snowstorm playing tricks on her eyes, but when she looked again, the group had stopped in front of the lodge, staring up at the windows. Their faces were emotionless, and their eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through the glass, meeting her gaze. She quickly turned away, her heart pounding in her chest. "We should head out," she said, her voice shaky. Her friends laughed it off, dismissing her concerns as a result of the storm. But Beth couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. Was it the weather? The isolation? Or was something more sinister at play? Something that had taken root in the very bones of the resort? As they made their way toward the ski lift, the snow continued to fall in heavy, thick flakes, almost as if nature itself were conspiring to trap them. The ski slopes, usually filled with excited skiers carving their way down the mountain, were eerily deserted. Only a few figures were visible in the distance, moving in slow, methodical patterns. Beth's unease deepened as they ascended the lift, the icy wind biting at her cheeks. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She glanced down, but the ground below seemed to vanish into a white abyss, making her feel both disconnected and claustrophobic. At the top of the slope, the silence only deepened. The world around her was swallowed by the snowstorm, and the only sound was the soft whisper of the wind. But it wasn't just the storm that whispered. It was something beneath the snow, something that Beth couldn't quite place. She had grown used to the howling wind, the hum of the lift, and the soft crunch of skis on powder. But now, there was something else, a low murmur, barely audible, almost like a distant conversation just out of reach. It sent a chill down her spine. "Did you hear that?" Beth asked, stopping abruptly. Her friends, already in motion, looked at her quizzically. "What? The wind?" "No," she insisted. "There's something else, something under the snow." They laughed it off, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks. But Beth couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was speaking to her from beneath the snow, hidden from sight. She looked around, but the mountain was empty, the only movement coming from the drifting snowflakes. Her heart raced as she turned to the others, but the look of concern she had hoped to see in their faces was absent. They were already setting off down the slope, eager to enjoy the fresh powder. But Beth couldn't follow. She stood frozen, listening, straining for any hint of sound that might explain the whispers. The low murmur grew louder, more distinct, as if the snow itself was speaking to her. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise ceased. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. She didn't ski that day. Instead, she wandered the resort, trying to shake the strange sensation that something was wrong. Everywhere she went, she felt the presence of eyes upon her, though no one ever seemed to be watching. The old man at the front desk, the skiers outside, none of them spoke. None of them moved in any way that felt natural. It was as if they were all part of a scene frozen in time, playing roles in a story that had long since lost its meaning. When evening came, the storm intensified again, isolating the resort from the outside world. The power flickered once more, casting long, haunting shadows across the walls. And the whispers, those whispers beneath the snow, seemed to grow louder still, reaching out to her from somewhere deep within the earth. Beth realized, with a creeping sense of dread, that the resort was not simply a place of escape. It was a place of confinement, a place where the mountain held its secrets close. Secrets that were buried beneath the snow, waiting for someone to uncover them. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury unmatched by anything Beth had ever experienced. She had never been particularly afraid of winter storms, but this one felt different. The snow piled up relentlessly, cutting off the resort from the outside world, and the temperature dropped to a level that seemed to freeze not only the air, but also time itself. As the hours wore on, the flickering lights, the empty halls, and the hushed conversations all began to blur together, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, than a vacation. Beth found herself wandering the halls again that evening. It was an odd impulse, one she couldn't quite explain, but it seemed as though she was drawn to the unknown corners of the resort, areas where she hadn't ventured before. Her friends were either relaxing by the fire or preparing for bed, but Beth couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. It was as if the place were calling to her, urging her to uncover its hidden truths. As she passed the lobby, she saw the old man again, standing by the front desk, staring out into the snowstorm through the large windows. His back was to her, and he appeared to be muttering something under his breath, a low, unintelligible sound that blended with the howling wind. Beth hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach him. There was a chill in the air that seemed to emanate from his presence, a coldness that felt unnatural. She shook her head, dismissing her thoughts as paranoia, and turned to leave. But as she walked past, she felt an unmistakable pull, as if something had reached out to grab her. The sensation was fleeting, but it was enough to make her stop in her tracks. She turned back, her heart pounding, and found that the man was no longer standing at the desk. In fact, the entire lobby was empty, the lights dimmed, and the silence even more oppressive than before. It felt as if the space had been abandoned in an instant, and Beth couldn't help but wonder where the old man had gone. A sudden creak from above sent a jolt through her body. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the floor above. But there was no one around to make them. Her pulse quickened as she glanced up, instinctively looking for some sign of movement, but all she saw was the dimly lit ceiling. The hotel had been eerily quiet all day, But now, in the stillness of the storm, the sound of footsteps above felt like an invasion into her already fragile sense of security. Compelled by a mixture of curiosity and dread, Beth decided to investigate. She slowly ascended the staircase, the wooden steps groaning beneath her feet, each creak louder than the last. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, the only light coming from the distant glow of the lobby far below. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, listening for any hint of the person or thing that had made the sound. As she walked further down the hallway, she noticed something strange, a door, slightly ajar, at the very end of the corridor. It wasn't a door she had seen before, nor had she ever noticed it on her previous trips through the resort. It was tucked away in a corner, as if purposely hidden from view. The air felt colder near the door, and a sense of unease crept over her as she approached. When she reached out to push the door open, the handle turned easily under her touch. It wasn't locked. Inside, the room was dark and still, but something about it felt different from the other rooms in the resort. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of waiting, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for years. The walls were bare, the furnishings sparse. Yet there was an undeniable presence in the space, something unseen but palpably there. Beth's heart raced, and she instinctively stepped back, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. She had not been alone in this room. She was certain of it. A fleeting image flashed in her mind. The old man behind the desk, the footsteps she had heard, and now this strange, empty room that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as though something or someone had been watching her every move. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, sharp and sudden. A loud thump, like the sound of something heavy falling to the ground. Beth froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around frantically, but the hallway was still empty, the only movement the drift of snow outside the window. The sound had come from inside the room, but now the room felt even colder, more oppressive. Without thinking, she stepped inside, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. As her foot crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further, and her breath came out in visible puffs, despite the fact that the rest of the resort was warm. The thumping sound had stopped, but something else replaced it. A faint whisper, low and guttural, coming from the far corner of the room. It sounded like words, but they were unintelligible, and they seemed to come from every direction at once. Beth's instinct screamed at her to leave, to run, but her body refused to obey. She stood frozen, unable to look away from the corner where the whispers seemed to originate. Then a movement, a figure, faint and translucent, flickered in the shadows. Beth's breath hitched, and for a moment, she thought she saw the outline of a person, a woman, her face obscured by dark hair. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the oppressive cold and the ever-present whispers. In a daze, Beth backed away from the room, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who had been in that room? What was that figure? The presence she had felt lingered like a dark cloud, following her as she turned and fled down the hallway. The footsteps from earlier seemed to echo in her ears, louder now, as if they were chasing her, beckoning her to return. She stumbled back into the lobby, her breath shallow, her body trembling. The place that had once seemed like a refuge now felt like a prison. She needed answers, but she had no idea where to find them. All she knew was that the storm was no longer the most frightening thing in the resort. It was the unseen guest, the one who lingered in the shadows, just beyond reach, always watching, always waiting. Beth's mind raced as she descended the stairs, her heart still hammering in her chest. The room, if it could even be called that, had left her shaken in ways she couldn't fully understand. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Who had been in that room before her? Was it the same old man who had been watching her earlier? Or was it something far older, something that had been part of the resort long before anyone had arrived? The questions swirled in her mind, each one adding another layer to the unease that had settled deep in her bones. She quickly found her friends in the main dining area, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the growing sense of danger surrounding them. They spoke about the snowstorm, about their plans for the next day, but to Beth, Everything felt hollow. She could barely focus on their words, her attention always slipping toward the corner of the room, where the darkened hallways seemed to stretch out endlessly. The storm had raged on, trapping them here, but now the resort itself felt like a trap, a place that was slowly closing in around her, suffocating her with its secrets. "Are you okay, Beth?" one of her friends asked, noticing the unease in her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, but the words felt empty even to her. "Just tired, I guess." But she wasn't tired. She was frightened, and she couldn't shake the image of that room, that cold, oppressive space with the whispering shadows. It was as if the resort had a life of its own, a dark, ancient presence that lingered in the walls, in the very air they breathed. Something had awakened here, something that had been dormant for a long time. She could feel it, and it made her skin crawl. As the night wore on, the storm outside only intensified. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the resort, but inside, the atmosphere remained unnaturally still. The usual chatter and laughter had died down, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The flickering lights, the eerie silence, it all fed into Beth's growing sense of isolation. The resort, once a place of warmth and comfort, had transformed into something unrecognizable. It was no longer a retreat from the world. It was a place that seemed to feed on fear, on uncertainty, drawing her deeper into its web with every passing minute. In a futile attempt to distract herself, Beth decided to take a walk outside. Perhaps the cold air would clear her head, she thought. Maybe she could shake off the feeling that something was watching her. But as she stepped outside, the full weight of the storm hit her, snow swirling around her in a blinding frenzy. She squinted into the wind, the snowflakes stinging her face like needles, and began walking toward the edge of the resort. As she neared the edge of the property, she could see the ski slopes in the distance, the bright lights casting long shadows over the white expanse. But the sight only deepened her sense of unease. The slopes were empty, completely empty. No skiers, no snowboarders, no signs of life at all. The mountain loomed in the distance, an imposing, silent presence, and something about it seemed off. It was as though the mountain itself were waiting, watching, just as she had been watched earlier. Beth stopped at the edge of the resort, her eyes fixed on the mountain. The storm had created an almost surreal landscape, with the snowdrifts rising in thick, jagged peaks, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she stared at the peaks. There was something about the way the snow clung to the mountainside, the way the wind howled through the trees, that felt wrong. It wasn't just the storm. It was something older, something ancient, buried deep within the earth. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the snow, moving with a strange, jerky rhythm. At first, Beth thought it was another skier, but as the figure grew closer, she realized it was not a person at all. It was a shadow, a moving shape, flickering in and out of existence like a reflection on the surface of ice. The figure seemed to move without form, as if it were not bound by the rules of the world. It hovered just above the snow, its edges blurring in and out of focus as though it were not quite real. Beth stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from it. The figure was silent, but its presence felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she knew instinctively that it wasn't a living thing. It was something else, something far more ancient and malevolent. The longer she watched, the more she felt the coldness of its gaze, as if it were watching her in return. Her heart pounded, and she instinctively took a step back. But before she could react, the figure disappeared into the snow, leaving behind nothing but the swirling storm. Beth's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the storm? Or had she truly seen something? Something that should not exist? She turned quickly and hurried back to the safety of the resort, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But when she looked over her shoulder, there was nothing. The snowstorm had swallowed everything in its path, and there was no sign of the shadow. Back inside, the warmth of the resort did little to ease her growing fear. She locked herself in her room, the unease gnawing at her until she could hardly breathe. She tried to shake off the image of the shadow, to tell herself it had been a trick of the mind, but deep down, she knew better. There was something wrong with this place, something far older and far darker than she had imagined. That night, as she lay in bed, she could hear the storm raging outside, the wind howling and the snow rattling against the windows. But it wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was the feeling that the shadow was still out there, waiting for her, just beyond the walls of the resort. It was a presence that had been there long before she had arrived, and it would be there long after she left. The resort, the mountain, and the storm, they were all part of something far bigger, something that had been buried under layers of snow and ice, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And Beth, unwittingly, had become part of it. Beth awoke the next morning to the sound of the wind still howling outside, a relentless force that seemed to be testing the very foundation of the resort. She had barely slept, the images of the shadow from the previous night looping through her mind like a recurring nightmare. Even though the storm had eased slightly, the sense of isolation remained thick in the air. The resort felt more like a fortress now, its walls not just physical barriers against the elements, but something deeper, something that kept the outside world at bay. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy snow, casting long, cold shadows across the empty halls. The silence felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Beth couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something that had shifted overnight. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air lingered. She forced herself to get out of bed, to move, to do something, anything, to shake off the dread that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. She walked to the dining area, hoping for some semblance of normalcy. Her friends were already there, gathered around the table, chatting idly, as if nothing had happened. They smiled at her as she entered, their faces warm with the kind of lightheartedness that only came with the first light of day. But to Beth, their laughter felt distant, out of place. It was as if she were watching them through a fog, disconnected from the world they inhabited. "Morning, Beth," one of her friends called out, offering her a cup of coffee. "You look like you didn't get much sleep last night." Beth smiled weakly, accepting the coffee. "Yeah, just the storm," she said, trying to sound casual. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole story. The storm had been unsettling, but it was the things she had seen, the shadow, the whispers, the cold, that kept her awake. As she sat down, she noticed that the atmosphere in the dining room had subtly shifted. It wasn't just the weather that felt different. There was something in the air, an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there the day before. People spoke in quieter tones, as though they too could sense something amiss. No one mentioned the odd occurrences of the previous night, but the silence between them seemed to speak volumes. They were all aware of something, but no one dared to address it directly. Beth's mind wandered again to the events she had experienced. She had seen the figure, the shadow that moved like smoke on the snow, and felt its cold, relentless gaze. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that whatever she had encountered, it wasn't a trick of her mind. She wasn't imagining things. Something was out there, something ancient and malevolent, and it was tied to the resort, to the mountain, to the storm itself. Suddenly, the door to the dining room opened with a loud bang, and the air seemed to shift. Everyone turned toward the entrance. Standing there, covered in snow and looking out of breath, was the old man, the one who had been in the lobby the night before, muttering to himself. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked like he had just come from the storm itself, as though the blizzard had swallowed him whole and spit him back out. Without a word, he stepped inside, his boots crunching on the floor as he made his way to the far corner of the room. He didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't even seem to notice the stunned looks directed at him. He simply sat down at an empty table, his eyes fixed on the window, where the storm still raged outside. It was as if he were waiting for something, watching for something, but no one dared ask what. Beth's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the man's presence that unsettled her. Something she couldn't explain. His silence, his intensity, the way he seemed to be in tune with the storm. It all felt too familiar, as if he were somehow connected to the strange happenings that had been plaguing the resort. She felt the pull to approach him, to ask him what he knew about the things that had been happening, but she held back. Something told her that talking to him might lead to answers she wasn't ready to hear. As the morning wore on, the storm outside intensified again, the wind picking up, howling in fury as if the mountain itself were alive and angry. The old man never moved, never spoke. He remained fixed in place, his gaze unwavering. The others began to eat, trying to go about their day as normal, but Beth couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. Something was coming. She stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the whiteout beyond. The snow had begun to fall heavier, and the landscape had transformed into an almost surreal blur of white. The edges of the world seemed to dissolve into the storm, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the distance. Something large, something dark, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She rubbed her eyes, trying to dismiss the thought, but the image lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just the storm. She realized it was the mountain. The mountain was alive, watching, waiting. It had been calling to her ever since she arrived, and now she could feel its pull more strongly than ever. There was something buried deep in the snow, in the earth itself, something tied to the resort, something that had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. Her thoughts were interrupted when the old man suddenly stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were gathering himself before a great effort. He turned to face the group, his eyes scanning each person in the room, but his gaze lingered on Beth for a moment longer than necessary. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes, a mix of sorrow and resignation, made her stomach drop. "The storm is not the worst of it," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "You've all felt it, haven't you? The pull of the mountain. It's been waiting, watching, for those who were meant to see." Beth froze, her pulse quickening. It was as if he had read her thoughts, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. The room fell silent as his words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. "None of you will leave until it's done," the old man continued, his voice now carrying a strange finality. "The storm, the mountain, it won't let you go." Beth felt a chill run through her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she truly understood the meaning behind his words. The storm wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a barrier, a veil, keeping them all trapped inside, trapped by something far older than they could comprehend. The storm outside grew louder, its fury seeming to match the growing sense of dread inside. Beth knew then that this wasn't just a vacation gone wrong. This was something much bigger, something that had been waiting for them all along. The old man's words hung in the air like an unspoken truth, reverberating through the walls of the resort. "You've all felt it, haven't you? The pull of the mountain. It's been waiting, watching, for those who were meant to see." Beth tried to process what he had said, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. The eerie feeling that had settled over the group, the sense of being trapped, the inexplicable dread that had been creeping in with each passing moment. All of it was tied to the mountain, to the resort itself. The storm had only been the catalyst, a physical manifestation of something far deeper, far more sinister. The silence in the room was suffocating, but no one dared speak. The old man had sat back down, his gaze distant once more, lost to the storm outside. Beth felt an overwhelming need to understand, to know what exactly was happening. But every time she tried to form a question, the words felt hollow, meaningless. What could anyone say in the face of such an ancient, unfathomable presence? It was her friend Lisa who finally broke the silence. "What do you mean by none of us will leave until it's done? What is this place?" Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. The old man didn't look at her. His attention remained fixed on the window, as though he were watching something beyond the snow, something only he could see. "You think this place is just a resort, a vacation spot," he began, his voice slow and deliberate. "But it's not. It never was. It's an old prison, built by people who thought they could contain something they didn't understand. But nothing stays contained forever." And now, he trailed off, shaking his head. Beth's heart raced. "A prison? For what?" She glanced around the room, her eyes meeting those of her friends, who were equally bewildered. No one spoke. The words felt too heavy, too strange to even consider. Yet the growing dread in her chest told her that there was truth in them. This place wasn't just a backdrop to their vacation. It was part of something much darker, something that had been quietly watching them all along. The storm outside seemed to pick up again, its howling winds rattling the windows, but the noise felt distant, muffled, as if it were coming from somewhere deeper within the mountain itself. It was a sound that seemed to resonate in her bones, an unnatural hum that made her skin crawl. She wanted to escape it, to run outside into the blizzard, but the thought of being alone in that storm, of being out there with whatever the old man had warned them about, kept her rooted to the spot. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught her eye. In the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to shift, twisting in a way that didn't belong to the light from the storm. The old man didn't react, but Beth felt her pulse quicken. There, just for a moment, a figure appeared, faint, almost translucent, like a shadow, stretched too thin. It was gone in an instant, but Beth was sure she had seen it. Her breath caught in her throat. Had someone else seen it too? She turned to her friends, her eyes wide, but they were all staring at the old man, their faces drawn and pale. None of them had noticed. Who built this place? Beth asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might disturb something hidden in the walls. Why is it here? The old man turned his gaze toward her, his eyes piercing and knowing. They were foolish. All of them. The ones who came before you. They thought they could tame the mountain. They didn't realize what they were dealing with, what they awakened. Beth felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She needed more answers, but the old man seemed to be growing more distant with every word. It was as if he were fading into the very air around him, his presence becoming part of the storm, part of the mountain. Do you know it's locked here? Beth pressed, unable to stop herself. What's inside? The old man's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. I know, he said quietly, but you don't want to. Not really. His words sent a chill through Beth's chest. She had to know. She had to understand what was going on. But the fear inside her fought against the need for knowledge. What if the truth was worse than she could imagine? What if the mountain itself had always been alive, waiting for the right moment to claim those who ventured too close? The air inside the resort had grown colder. Beth could see her breath, even though the fire in the hearth had been roaring for hours. Her friends were silent now, their eyes locked on the old man, their faces pale. No one seemed to know what to say, what to do. The storm outside had trapped them here, and now it seemed that the mountain itself was closing in, its presence felt in every crack, in every gust of wind. Beth's mind swirled with 1,000 questions. What was it that the old man knew? Who had he been? And why had he returned now? More importantly, what was the thing that had been locked away all these years? She had to find out. She had to understand, before it was too late. But just as she was about to speak again, a sound broke the silence, a distant, low rumble, like thunder, but deeper, vibrating through the very ground beneath them. The walls of the resort trembled slightly, as though the mountain itself were shifting, awakening. Then, the lights flickered, dimming for a split second before stabilizing. The air grew heavier, thick with the oppressive weight of something ancient and powerful. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if it were trying to break through the very fabric of the building. And in that moment, Beth realized that whatever had been locked away, whatever had been waiting all this time, was no longer content to remain hidden. It was coming. The room trembled again, and the deep rumble that had shaken the foundation of the resort intensified, reverberating through the walls as though the mountain itself were stirring, waking from a long slumber. Beth's pulse raced. She wasn't sure whether the rumble was the result of the storm or something far more sinister, but the air had thickened around them, heavy with an unspoken dread. The old man, his eyes fixed on the window, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, his face growing even more pale, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The energy in the room was enough to tell them all that something was wrong. The other guests, still seated around the table, looked increasingly uneasy, exchanging nervous glances. It was as if the storm outside had seeped inside, infecting the very space they inhabited. No one dared speak, their words frozen by the same oppressive feeling that was tightening around Beth's chest. The cold had become unbearable, and it wasn't just the temperature. It was the realization that whatever force had been awakened wasn't something that could be easily escaped. Beth turned her attention back to the old man, her voice shaky but determined. "What's happening?" she demanded, hoping that he might offer some form of explanation, or at least some guidance. She was done with half-truths and cryptic warnings. They needed answers now. The old man slowly turned his gaze toward her, his eyes glistening with a strange, knowing sadness. "It's not the storm that's coming," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "It's what's beneath it, what's been buried under all that snow for centuries." His words seemed to hang in the air like a fog, thick and impenetrable. "You've all been chosen," he added, his voice laced with resignation. "Chosen to witness the end." Beth's heart skipped a beat. Chosen? The words echoed in her mind, reverberating off the walls of the room. She felt a chill run down her spine. There was something deeply wrong about everything that had been unfolding. The storm, the strange occurrences, the shadow she had seen the night before. It was all connected to this mountain. But how? What was buried here? What had they stumbled upon? The old man's gaze dropped, and for a moment, he seemed to lose himself in thought. His hands trembled more noticeably now, the fingers curling slightly as if they were reaching for something that wasn't there. It was as if he were fighting an invisible force that had taken hold of him. Then, in a sudden burst of clarity, he looked up at Beth, his expression more intense than before. "There's a reason why this place is abandoned now," he whispered urgently. "People used to live here, work here. They thought they could keep it hidden, keep it sealed away. But they failed." Beth's mind raced. "What do you mean they failed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old man's eyes seemed to flash with something dark, a shadow of memory flickering behind them. He leaned forward, his voice growing softer still. "The mountain isn't just a place. It's a prison for the forgotten ones, the ones who came before. And now," he trailed off, his voice faltering as though he could hardly bring himself to speak the words. "Now they're coming back," he finished, his voice thick with dread. Beth stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the weight of his words. Forgotten ones? People who had been imprisoned here, buried beneath the snow, waiting for release? The mountain itself had been hiding them? She tried to shake the thought, but it clung to her like the cold that now seemed to seep into her very bones. Something had been hidden here, something ancient, and it was about to be unleashed. The wind outside howled louder, and with it came a sharp, eerie shriek. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was as though the mountain itself had a voice, a terrifying sound that resonated deep within the earth. The room seemed to shudder in response, and the lights flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. Beth looked toward the window, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a figure, faint but distinct, standing outside in the snowstorm. It was too distant to make out clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable, tall, dark, with the form of a person, or perhaps something more. Her heart raced as she stared at the figure, her mind screaming for her to look away, to deny what she was seeing. The figure moved, gliding effortlessly through the snow, as if it weren't impeded by the storm. Beth's breath caught in her throat. She knew what she was seeing wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The shape twisted and shifted with the wind, but there was no mistaking it now. Something was out there, something that shouldn't be, something that had been waiting. Beth's thoughts were interrupted as the old man muttered something under his breath, his eyes wide with panic. "They've found us," he whispered, almost to himself. "The forgotten ones, they've found us, and they're coming." Panic swept through the room. The others had seen the figure too. Their faces drained of color as they rushed toward the windows, pressing their faces against the cold glass. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was real, but it wasn't alone. Slowly, others began to emerge from the storm, all of them moving in the same eerie, fluid manner, gliding through the snow as though they were part of it. They were too far to hear, but their presence filled the air with a palpable, bone-chilling terror. Beth stepped back from the window, her mind reeling. The Forgotten Ones, the prisoners of the mountain, they had been locked away for reasons unknown, hidden beneath the snow and the storm. But now they were free, and they were coming for them. The storm outside reached a crescendo, the wind howling louder than ever. The ground beneath the resort seemed to vibrate, as though the mountain itself was shaking, ready to release its terrible secret. Beth's body went numb with fear, but she could not tear her gaze away from the figure moving closer, nor could she ignore the other forms that had now surrounded the resort, slowly closing in. There was no escape. The mountain was alive, and it was hungry. The storm had reached its peak. The wind was no longer a mere backdrop to the terror that gripped the resort. It was a living thing now, thrashing against the walls with the force of 1,000 screams. The howling outside had become an unbearable roar, punctuated by the sound of something scraping against the building. Claws, nails, or something worse, scraping against wood and stone as though we're trying to tear the very fabric of the resort apart. Beth stood frozen by the window, staring out into the blizzard, unable to look away from the figures that moved through the snow. They were no longer distant, ethereal shapes. The shadows that had seemed like figments of her imagination now had form, and their movements were deliberate, purposeful. The figure from earlier was closer now, its shape becoming clearer. It was tall, its limbs long and thin, bending unnaturally at the joints. There was no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where a head should have been, and something about its movement was wrong, like it was not meant to walk, to exist in this plane. Beth's breath fogged up the glass as she tried to steady herself. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Could she outrun them? Could they even be outrun? The old man's words were still fresh in her mind. The Forgotten Ones. She now understood that these figures were not just manifestations of her fear. They were real, tangible, and they had a purpose. And that purpose was to claim the mountain and everyone within it. Behind her, the other guests were scrambling to gather their things, their panic palpable. Some tried to lock the doors. Others looked for any kind of weapon or means of defense, though none of them had any idea how to fight what was coming. The air inside the resort had turned freezing, the chill creeping into their very bones. The fire in the hearth had gone out long ago, its warmth swallowed by the unnatural cold that had settled over the building. It was as if the mountain was taking everything from them, every comfort, every sense of safety. It was stripping them down to their most primal fears, leaving them with nothing but the terror of the unknown. Beth! Lisa's voice broke through the growing panic. Her friend was standing by the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do? How do we stop them? Beth turned slowly, feeling the weight of her own helplessness settle in. She had no answers. She had no idea how to fight this, how to escape. All she had were the old man's cryptic warnings and the realization that the mountain was alive, that whatever force had been buried here for so long was waking up, and now it was hungry. For them. She glanced at the old man, who was still sitting in his chair by the window, staring at the snowstorm outside. His expression had shifted from fear to something colder, resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. It was as if he had seen this all before, as though he had long ago come to terms with the inevitability of what was happening. "They're not here to kill you," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse but steady. "They're here to take you, to drag you into the mountain, into the snow, into their prison." His words sent a fresh wave of dread through the group. Beth felt the floor beneath her feet shift, as though the mountain itself was shifting, pulling them closer to its heart. "What do you mean? What prison?" she asked, barely able to form the question through the lump in her throat. "The prison I told you about," the old man muttered. "The one beneath the snow. The one that keeps them in. But it's not just them. It's you too." Beth's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" The old man's eyes met hers, his gaze unsettling in its intensity. "You came here thinking you were just escaping from your lives. You thought you could hide. But the mountain, it knows you. All of you. You are as much a part of this place as the things trapped in it. And once you're inside, there's no escape. There was a moment of stunned silence as everyone absorbed his words. It was like a weight had settled on their shoulders, something heavier than the snow, than the cold, than the storm. Beth's heart was pounding in her chest as she struggled to understand. Had they been chosen to be part of the Forgotten Ones? Had they been brought here to serve as replacements, as sacrifices to the mountain itself? Another screech from the outside shattered the silence, a sound so shrill that it made their teeth ache. The figures were no longer just moving through the snow. They were surrounding the resort, their movements synchronized, deliberate. They weren't coming for them individually. They were coming for everyone. The Forgotten Ones were closing in. Beth's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. If they were truly part of this place, if the mountain itself had claimed them, was there any hope? Could they fight back? The air was thick with the stench of fear, and as she looked at the others, she could see that none of them had any answers either. They were all just running on instinct, trying to survive, trying to hold on to whatever shred of humanity they had left. But even as the terror tightened around them, something strange happened. The figure outside, the one closest to the window, paused. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly as though listening, sensing something that the others couldn't hear. It was as if the mountain itself had shifted in its attention. The Forgotten Ones were no longer just mindless phantoms. They were aware. They were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Beth felt the weight of the silence settle back in, thick and suffocating. Her thoughts raced, but they were becoming harder to hold on to, slipping through her mind like snow through her fingers. One thing was certain now. The mountain wasn't just a prison for the Forgotten Ones. It was a prison for anyone who dared to come too close. And there was no escape from it. Outside, the storm raged on. But Beth knew, deep down, that the worst of it wasn't the wind or the snow. The worst of it was inside, under the mountain, where something ancient, something dark, was waiting for them all. And it was getting closer. As the storm outside worsened, the tension inside the resort was almost unbearable. The walls seemed to close in on them, each creak of wood, each gust of wind, amplifying the mounting sense of doom that had settled like a weight in the pit of Beth's stomach. The figures outside were growing closer, now no longer just indistinct shadows. They had massed around the resort in eerie stillness, their presence palpable in the cold, suffocating air. Beth could feel their gaze, as though their eyes were boring through the thick walls of the resort, seeking her, seeking all of them. The other guests were no better off than she was. Some had retreated into the corners, huddling together in whispered conversations, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Others, like Lisa, paced frantically, her hands trembling as she mumbled incoherently about escape routes and survival. No one seemed to know what to do, and the uncertainty was the most terrifying thing of all. There was no clear enemy, no immediate threat they could fight. The mountain itself, alive with ancient malevolence, had become their prison. It had turned the resort into a gilded cage, and the storm outside was its lock. The old man remained seated by the window, his gaze never leaving the storm. His silence was unnerving now. He had spoken of the Forgotten Ones, of a prison beneath the snow, and yet it felt like he was withholding something crucial, something even darker than the threat they were facing. What was it? What had he seen? The desperation in Beth's mind pushed her to approach him, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. It felt like whatever truth he had, it would only plunge them deeper into the nightmare. Then, in a voice that sent a chill through the room, the old man spoke again. "You think you're safe in here. You think the walls can protect you. But the real prison is not the building. It's the mountain itself. It's the snow. It's everywhere." His words seemed to echo through the room, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. His gaze shifted to Beth, his eyes hollow. "What you need to understand is that it's not just the Forgotten Ones that are coming for you. It's the mountain. It will take you one by one, until you're part of it. Just another layer of its history." Beth felt her throat tighten. There was no escape. They were already part of the mountain. They had come here, seeking refuge, seeking peace, and now they were part of the mountain's cursed legacy. It had always been watching them, waiting for them to slip into its grasp. She had thought that the snow, the storm, were the natural threats. But now she understood they were only the veil. The true horror was what lay beneath. Why us? Lisa suddenly demanded, her voice hoarse with fear. Why us? What did we do to deserve this? The old man's lips curled into a grim smile, though there was no warmth in it. You didn't deserve it, he said. But you came here looking for something, didn't you? You were all running from something. From your lives. From your past. The mountain knows that. It can sense it, and it uses it. The forgotten ones are its messengers. But you are its offering. Once you're here, once the mountain knows you, there's no leaving. You'll be swallowed whole. The room fell silent again, each person lost in the enormity of what the old man had just revealed. Beth's chest tightened, her mind reeling. She thought of the others, the guests, the strangers who had come here with her. She thought of her own arrival, how she had tried to escape the weight of her past, how she had thought the isolation of the mountain would be the perfect place to start over. How foolish she had been. They were all fools, running from their past into the arms of something far worse than anything they had fled. Outside, the storm had reached a crescendo. The wind whipped against the walls with violent force, and the sound of something scraping along the sides of the resort filled the air again. But now, the scraping was joined by something else, a low, guttural growl, like an animal trapped beneath the earth. It seemed to vibrate the very foundation of the resort. Beth's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to the window again, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered outside. The figures were gone. In their place, something far more terrifying had appeared. The snow had started to shift, as though it were alive, moving in unnatural patterns. It wasn't just snow anymore. It was a living, breathing entity, a mass of white that undulated and twisted as it moved. And at the center of it, rising from the earth like a towering nightmare, was something far darker than any shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was indistinct, shifting constantly, as though it couldn't settle into a single form. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It was the mountain itself, awakened, and it was calling to them. Beth stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. The mountain wasn't just alive, it was sentient, malevolent, and it had always been watching them. It wasn't just seeking them out. It had been waiting for them to come. They were the catalyst, the spark that would bring its ancient hunger back to life. And now, there was nowhere to hide. There was nowhere left to run. The ground beneath the resort shuddered again, the vibrations growing stronger, almost as if the mountain itself was preparing to swallow them whole. The walls groaned, the foundation creaking with an unnatural force. Beth could feel the air around her thickening, pressing down on her chest, squeezing the life from her. The mountain was closing in. One by one, the other guests looked toward the old man, their eyes filled with terror, seeking some kind of salvation, some hope. But he said nothing. His gaze was still fixed on the window, on the shifting snow outside. He had accepted his fate long ago. The mountain had already claimed him, just as it was claiming them now. Beth's legs buckled beneath her as the weight of it all hit her. There was no escaping it. The mountain had never wanted them to escape. It had only wanted them to enter, to become part of its forgotten past, to join the others who had fallen victim to its endless hunger. And as the wind howled louder and the earth beneath her feet began to crack, Beth realized with sickening certainty that the worst was yet to come. The mountain wasn't just going to take them. It was going to break them. It was going to twist them into something unrecognizable, something that belonged to the snow, to the dark, ancient forces buried deep within the earth. And they were already too late to stop it. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, and the winds howling now seemed to take on a voice of its own, an unnatural cry that reverberated through the walls of the resort. Beth's mind, still racing from the horror outside, couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain itself was speaking to them, calling to them in a language older than the snow that covered it. She had always thought of storms as natural events, forces of nature that followed a predictable course. But this was something else entirely. The storm wasn't just weather. It was an entity, a force that was manipulating the air, the earth, the very space around them. As she stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the other guests, their faces pale and stricken with terror, she felt the weight of their collective fear pressing down on her. It was as though they were all drawn together, bound by some unseen force that had brought them here to this point. Every one of them had arrived in search of something: escape, peace, or simply a break from their lives. But now, all of them were caught in the same nightmare, and none of them knew how to wake up. The old man was still by the window, his eyes fixed on the snow, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the way he stood, something in his stillness, that made Beth uneasy. He had always seemed like a figure out of place in this world, an artifact from another time, and now he seemed less like a man and more like part of the landscape itself. His presence, though passive, had an unnatural quality, as if he was more attuned to the mountain's rhythm than any of them. It was as if he understood the storm and its meaning in a way that none of the rest of them could. And then, as if the old man had been waiting for this moment, he turned slowly toward Beth, his voice a low murmur that seemed to cut through the chaos of the storm. "The mountain speaks," he said, his words sending a chill down her spine. "You think you've heard it all. Voices in the wind, the creaking of the walls, the scratching at the door. But those aren't just sounds. The mountain is trying to reach you, to draw you in. You're not just its guests. You're its prisoners, its offerings." Beth felt a shiver run down her spine. The old man's words weren't just cryptic. They felt like a warning, like a final piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. There was no doubting his sincerity. His words resonated in her bones, like they were familiar in some dark, primal way. She had heard stories of mountains with strange powers, places where people had vanished without a trace, where the land itself seemed to consume anyone who ventured too close. But this was something more. This wasn't just a haunted place. This was a living, breathing entity, ancient and hungry. The others were beginning to lose their composure. Lisa, who had been pacing nervously for hours, suddenly stopped and looked toward the door. Her eyes were wide with panic, her breath coming in short gasps. "It's not just the storm," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the mountain. It's alive. It wants us." Beth couldn't answer. She didn't know what to say. The mountain was alive. She could feel it now, not just in the wind or the storm, but in the air itself, thick with a presence that was suffocating. It wasn't the snow that was dangerous. It was the land beneath their feet, the very ground they stood on. The mountain was alive, and it was watching them. Outside, the snow had begun to shift again, moving in unnatural ways, like an ocean stirred by an unseen force. The ground shook beneath them, a deep, resonant tremor that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. The lights flickered, dimming as if the power itself was being drained by some unseen force. In the flickering shadows, figures could be seen, pale, distorted shapes moving just beyond the reach of the storm's fury. Beth felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the figures grew closer, their features becoming more defined in the dim light. They were like nothing she had ever seen before, their forms barely human, more like shadows of the past, twisted and contorted by the mountain's will. The old man's voice broke the silence again, low and steady. "They are the forgotten ones. They were once like you, lost, searching for something. And the mountain claimed them. Now they're its agents, its messengers. They come to take you, to add you to its history. There is no escape. There is no way out." Beth's heart raced as she glanced at the others. They were all looking toward the door, too terrified to move but too fearful to stay in place. The figures outside had gathered in a circle, their movements synchronized, as though they were performing a ritual. Beth could feel the air growing colder, the temperature dropping as the figures seemed to hum, their presence radiating a sense of ancient power. The storm outside began to swell, and with it, the voices of the mountain grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the snow itself was calling to them, urging them to step outside, to join the figures in the circle. But the old man's voice rose again, cutting through the madness. "Do not listen to it. The mountain will call to you. It will make you believe that you belong to it. It will promise you release from your fears, from your past. But it is a lie. Once you step into its embrace, you are lost. Beth looked toward the door again, the figures now close enough that she could see their hollow eyes, their twisted faces. It was as if the mountain had stripped them of their humanity, leaving only vessels to carry out its will. She could feel the pull, the desire to step outside, to give herself over to the mountain's call. But a voice inside her, deep within her soul, screamed that to do so would be to lose everything, to lose herself. The old man, sensing the shift in the room, stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he were preparing to face the mountain itself. "This is the breaking point," he said, his voice grave. "You will either succumb to the mountain's will, or you will fight. But know this, once you are touched by its power, there is no returning to who you were. You will never leave here the same." Beth's legs shook as she fought to steady herself. The mountain was real, the storm was real, and the mountain's voice was becoming deafening, too loud to ignore, too powerful to resist. There was no escaping the call. The question now wasn't whether they could leave. The question was whether any of them would survive once the mountain had claimed them. Beth had always considered herself to be a logical person, rational, grounded in reason. Her life had been built on careful planning and control. Yet standing in that room, surrounded by the palpable weight of the mountain's influence, she found it impossible to hold on to those principles. The storm outside wasn't just a storm. The whispers in the wind weren't just a trick of nature. And the figures in the snow, staring in through the windows with hollow eyes, weren't merely figments of her imagination. The mountain, she was beginning to realize, wasn't just a place. It was an entity, and it had been waiting for them. The others were beginning to lose themselves. Fear was no longer something they could control. It had become their reality. Lisa had retreated into the corner, rocking back and forth, whispering to herself as though trying to ward off the mountain's influence. Craig, the once brazen young man who had laughed off the old man's warnings, was now visibly shaking, his hands gripping the back of a chair as though it were his only lifeline. Even the old man, who had seemed so composed and certain in his knowledge of the mountain, looked weary, his eyes growing more distant as the storm's power pressed in on them. Beth's gaze flickered to the window again. The figures outside were closer now, their faces becoming clearer with each passing moment. There was something unnervingly familiar about them, a sense that she had seen them before, though she couldn't quite place where or when. It was as though the mountain had taken pieces of the past and twisted them into something unrecognizable. Their eyes, empty and endless, seemed to beckon to her, pulling her toward them with an invisible thread. "What do we do now?" Beth's voice was barely a whisper, the question more for herself than anyone else. She knew the answer, but it was too terrifying to face. The old man, sensing her struggle, turned to her slowly, his face pale but resolute. "Survive," he said simply. "The mountain gives you two choices. You can succumb, or you can endure. There is no escape, no safe haven, only survival. And even then, survival comes at a price." Beth's stomach churned. Survival. That word had never seemed so hollow. How could anyone survive in a place like this, surrounded by a force so ancient and powerful that it twisted the very fabric of reality itself? The storm, the figures outside, the unsettling hum in the air, these were all part of the mountain's will. It was the mountain that had brought them here, and it was the mountain that would decide who would leave and who would remain. The old man walked to the center of the room, his eyes never leaving the door. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were preparing himself for something. He muttered something under his breath, a low incantation that Beth couldn't understand, but the very air seemed to shift with his words, thickening, becoming heavier. The others watched him, but none of them dared to speak. They were like children, huddled in the shadow of something far too powerful to comprehend. "Do you hear it?" the old man asked suddenly, his voice sharp, pulling Beth from her daze. He looked at her directly, his eyes piercing, as though searching for something in her. "The mountain calls, but it doesn't just call to you. It calls to all of us. It is a test, a reckoning. And every time the storm comes, it brings something different. Beth strained to listen. At first, all she could hear was the wind howling and the creaking of the old building. But then, beneath it, almost like a distant hum, there was something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind or the storm. It was a voice, deep and guttural, echoing from the very bowels of the mountain itself. It called to them, a promise and a threat intertwined, offering something they couldn't refuse, something they couldn't resist. "We've all heard it," the old man continued, his voice shaking now. "We've all been marked by it, whether we knew it or not. But the question remains, what will you do when the mountain speaks to you? Will you listen? Will you give in to its pull? Or will you fight it?" Beth felt a chill run down her spine. The mountain wasn't just a place. It was a consciousness, a being with desires, with an agenda. It had called to each of them, and now they were all caught in its web. There was no running. There was no hiding. The only thing left to do was to face it, to confront it in whatever form it would take. And then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, the door to the outside burst open. The wind howled, a deafening roar that seemed to drown out everything else as the figures from the snow poured into the room. They were not human anymore, if they had ever been. Their faces were twisted, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. But their eyes still held something familiar. Something that Beth couldn't place, but that gnawed at her every time she looked at them. They moved with purpose, each step deliberate, as though they were walking towards something that only they could see. The others screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the storm, by the oppressive weight of the mountain's power. The figures didn't speak, but their presence alone was enough to freeze Beth's blood. There was no escape now. The mountain had come for them, and there was nowhere to run. Beth could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. But something in her, a small, stubborn spark of defiance, refused to give in. The mountain may have taken them all to this point, but it had not broken them yet. There was still a fight left, and for the first time, Beth knew that the true battle was not against the storm, not against the figures in the snow. It was against the mountain itself. "We won't go," Beth said, her voice shaking but strong. "We won't give in. We'll survive." The old man looked at her then, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps? Or was it resignation? Either way, it was too late to turn back now. The mountain had set its sights on them, and the only thing left was to face it, to find a way to survive its deadly embrace. But even as the figures closed in, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that survival, in the end, might be a fate worse than death. The coldness of the figures who now filled the room with their presence was unlike anything Beth had ever felt. Their bodies, stiff and unnatural, seemed to flicker in the half-light, as if they were not entirely there. Yet, despite their eerie form, their eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, burned with a strange recognition. They weren't just standing in front of Beth and the others. They were staring into them, as though reading every thought, every hidden fear. Beth felt herself exposed, vulnerable to something far beyond her understanding. The old man stood motionless, his face a mask of grim acceptance. He seemed to be waiting, watching for something. The room was thick with the weight of anticipation, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stretch, elongating every second until it was unbearable. Then, one of the figures, Beth couldn't tell which, for they all looked the same, stepped forward. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, as though it were gliding rather than walking, its feet never quite touching the ground. It raised a hand, the fingers long and unnerving, and pointed directly at Beth. In that instant, the air grew colder, and the whispers from the mountain grew louder. They were not words, not exactly, more like a feeling, a sensation in her mind, as though the mountain was offering her something. Something deeply tempting, but also deeply unsettling. It was not a voice in the conventional sense, but it was clear. Join us. Accept the offer. Beth's pulse quickened. The figure's gaze bore into her with an intensity that was both alien and familiar. The offer it presented, whatever it was like a poison laced with sweetness. She could feel the allure of it, an irresistible pull that reached into the very core of her being. The mountain, it seemed, was not just testing them physically. It was testing their will, their resolve. It was offering them something, but what? Was it salvation? Power? A way to escape the madness of the storm? Or was it something worse? Something that would bind them to the mountain forever, condemning them to its twisted existence? The old man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. Do not listen to it. The mountain offers only illusions. It is a deceiver, a master of manipulation. It offers you nothing but your destruction. The figure in front of Beth tilted its head slightly, as if considering the old man's words. Then, in a voice that was neither male nor female, but a strange blend of both, it spoke. You misunderstand. The offer is not to destroy, but to transcend. This is what you seek. All of you have come here for a reason. The mountain knows this. It knows your desires. It can give you what you want if you only accept. Beth felt a surge of panic. Transcend? What did that even mean? And why was the mountain so certain of their desires? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Her thoughts flashed to the others. Craig, still trembling, had his eyes locked on the figure. Lisa was clutching her head as if trying to block out the whispers. They were all hearing the same thing, all feeling the same pull. But none of them were acting. They were all frozen, each person held in place by the weight of their own fears. The mountain had them. It knew them better than they knew themselves, and it had already decided what they wanted. They didn't have the luxury of choice. At least that's what Beth feared. But deep down, buried beneath the paralyzing dread, there was a voice, a small, rebellious part of her, that refused to surrender. She had not come this far only to be consumed by the mountain's will. Whatever the offer was, it was a trap. No, Beth said, her voice cracking at first, but gaining strength with each word. I won't accept. I won't give in to you. The figure's gaze didn't waver. It was as though Beth's words didn't matter. Or perhaps, in the grand design of the mountain, they didn't. The figure remained silent for a moment, as if contemplating her defiance. Then it smiled, a slow, almost sorrowful smile, as if it had already anticipated this outcome. Its expression softened, but the malice behind it was palpable. You are stronger than most, it said, its voice a soft murmur in the cold air. But strength alone cannot save you. The mountain always wins in the end. It has time on its side. You will return to it. You will all return to it. Beth felt her knees grow weak. The figure's words seemed to seep into her very bones, twisting her sense of time and reality. What did it mean by return? And why did it speak with such certainty? She knew it wasn't just talking about this moment. It was speaking of something far darker, far more ancient. The mountain wasn't just testing them for sport. It had a purpose that transcended their understanding. It wasn't trying to kill them, not in the traditional sense. No, it was trying to reshape them, to bend them to its will. The old man stepped forward, his voice rising in a forceful tone. Do not be fooled. The mountain is patient, but it is not invincible. We still have a choice. It may seem inevitable, but nothing is ever truly inevitable. The figure laughed, a sound that echoed in the cavernous room, hollow and resonant. You are a fool if you believe that. The mountain has already won. You only delay the inevitable. Beth's heart pounded in her chest, a storm raging inside her as fiercely as the one outside. The figure's words twisted in her mind, their meaning elusive, yet undeniable. It was right. The mountain had already won. But was that truly the end? Was there no way to break free? No way to resist? The whispers grew louder, urging her to listen, to accept, to give in. But Beth held firm. She couldn't, not yet. The figure stepped back, and the others remained motionless, as if in a trance. Beth didn't know how much longer they had before the mountain took its final toll, before it consumed them all. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let it win without a fight. With a deep breath, she turned to the old man, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. We can't let it take us. There has to be something we can do. He nodded slowly, his eyes dark with the weight of unspoken knowledge. There is always a way, but it will not be easy. The mountain has many faces, but we are not without hope. Not yet. Beth didn't know what hope meant anymore, not in a place like this. But as the figure retreated, vanishing into the shadows, she realized one thing. Hope was all they had left, and she would hold on to it for as long as she could. The room remained still, its air thick with a tension so palpable it seemed to cling to Beth's skin. The figure's retreat left behind an unsettling silence, one that felt suffocating in its weight. The others, too, were still, as if frozen in the aftermath of a shock they couldn't fully comprehend. Beth's mind raced, desperately trying to piece together what had just happened. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss, one that threatened to swallow everything whole. But there was no choice but to continue forward. The mountain was not done with them yet, and neither was the terror it had begun to weave. The old man, who had been a quiet observer for so much of this strange ordeal, finally spoke again. His voice was low, grave, as if every word he said carried the weight of some hidden truth. The mountain does not show us its true face all at once. It is a deceiver. It lures you with promises, with illusions, but beneath it all, it is something far darker. And it knows you. It knows your weaknesses, your fears, your desires. Beth swallowed hard, trying to push down the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. His words rang with a truth she couldn't deny. There was something about the mountain, something ancient and insidious, that seemed to reach into the very core of their beings. She had thought the horrors they faced so far were the worst of it, but the more they encountered, the clearer it became. The mountain's grip was tightening, and it wasn't just the storm outside that was closing in on them. As the old man continued, his gaze focused on the others, who were still caught in their own private struggles. "It doesn't matter who you are or where you've come from," he said, his voice steady. "The mountain doesn't care about your past. It only cares about what it can take from you, what you are willing to give." Beth's thoughts flickered to the strange figure from moments ago, the way it had spoken of transcendence, of an offer too tempting to refuse. It was as though the mountain knew them better than they knew themselves, understood their deepest fears and desires. Was that what it wanted? To twist them into something else, something unrecognizable? The idea of returning to the mountain haunted her, but she couldn't quite grasp its meaning. Could they resist? Or were they doomed to become part of the mountain's twisted reality, like so many before them? Lisa was the first to break the silence. Her voice was trembling, raw, as she turned to the old man. "What do we do now? You said there was always a way. But how? How do we fight this?" Her eyes were wide, filled with the same fear that churned in Beth's gut. The old man's expression softened, but there was no trace of hope in his eyes. "Fighting it is not what you think. The mountain doesn't respond to force, not like you would expect. It is not an enemy you can simply strike down. Its power lies in what you don't see, in the paths it offers that seem like salvation but only lead to more suffering." Beth could feel the weight of his words settling in her bones. The path ahead wasn't just about physical endurance or even survival. It was a mental and emotional battle. It was about resisting the pull, the allure of whatever promises the mountain made. But what could they rely on if not their instincts? The storm outside raged louder, its howling winds reverberating through the walls of the cabin, a constant reminder of the suffocating isolation they were in. Craig spoke up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You said the mountain knows us. What if it knows us too well? What if it has already won? How can we fight something that knows everything about us?" The old man looked at Craig with a gaze that was almost pitying. "Because it may know you, but it doesn't know everything. It can see your surface, your fears, your desires. But it cannot see what lies deep within you. It cannot see your will to resist, your capacity for choice. It's that part of you that the mountain cannot control, and it's the only thing you can trust." Beth wanted to believe him. She did. But every time she thought about the figure, its hollow eyes and the promises it had made, doubt crept in. The mountain's grip seemed unbreakable, and no matter how much they resisted, it felt as though the mountain was always one step ahead. She could feel the weight of its presence even now, lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Then what do we do? Beth asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. How do we stop it from taking us? The old man's eyes flickered toward the window, where the blizzard had turned the world outside into a white, impenetrable void. The storm raged on, but it wasn't just the weather they had to fear now. The mountain had shown them its face, and that face was more terrifying than anything they had imagined. You must face the mountain on its terms, the old man said, his voice low. But you must not be fooled by its illusions. There is always a path forward, but it will not be the one you expect, and you will not walk it alone. Beth felt a shiver run down her spine. What did he mean by that? The words were cryptic, too vague to offer any real comfort. But they were all they had. They were running out of time, and the mountain's presence grew heavier with each passing moment. There had to be a way out, but if the mountain knew their every move, how could they hope to escape? As she looked at the others, Craig, Lisa, the old man, Beth realized something. They were all in this together. Their survival depended not just on resisting the mountain, but on trusting each other. For now, that was the only path they could follow. Together, they might just find a way to defy the mountain's grip. But even as she clung to that fragile hope, she knew one thing for certain. The real challenge had only just begun. The mountain had shown them its offer, its twisted promise, and now it was up to them to decide what came next. But the question remained, would they have the strength to refuse it, or would they, too, succumb to the mountain's whispering call? The night was a dense shroud of snow and wind, the storm outside a perfect reflection of the turmoil brewing inside the cabin. The fire flickered weakly in the hearth, its orange glow battling against the oppressive chill that had taken hold of the room. Beth sat on the edge of her seat, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. The old man's words had lingered with her, sinking into her mind like cold stones, heavy and unyielding. He had spoken of paths, of choices, but what did that really mean? And how could they trust that any path they took would lead to safety? Lisa paced back and forth, muttering under her breath, her face a portrait of frustration. Craig, on the other hand, had retreated into a corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The tension in the room was thick, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own fears, and the silence between them was suffocating. I don't know if I can keep going like this, Lisa finally said, her voice strained. This place, it's not just the storm. It's the mountain. She turned to the old man, her eyes wide with desperation. You said there's always a way forward, but what if there isn't? What if we're just trapped here? The old man's face, usually so inscrutable, seemed to soften with a sadness that Beth couldn't quite place. You are not trapped, he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying an unspoken weight. But the mountain will try to make you believe that. It will twist your perception until you see no way out. That is how it works. It feeds on your fear, your doubts. The only way forward is to look past that. Beth felt a sharp pang in her chest. She couldn't ignore the truth of what he said. The mountain had already twisted their perceptions. The very idea that they were being watched, manipulated, it made the walls feel smaller, the air more oppressive. What had once seemed like a desperate fight for survival was now beginning to feel like something much darker. The mountain wasn't just a force of nature. It was a mind, a will that could bend their own minds to its purpose. You said we have to trust each other, Beth said, her voice wavering. But how can we do that when we don't even know what's real anymore? The old man met her gaze, his eyes sharp with a clarity that made her uneasy. Because you are real. That is the one thing the mountain cannot change. Your will, your ability to choose. It may show you illusions, it may confuse you with your own memories, but in the end, the choice is always yours. The path ahead is not predetermined. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. But you must be careful. The mountain will show you what you fear most, and if you follow that path, it will lead you astray. Beth's heart beat faster, and for a moment, she thought she could feel the pulse of the mountain itself beneath the floorboards. It was a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the thrum of some ancient machine grinding its gears. It was as if the mountain was alive, aware of every thought, every doubt, and it had already begun to shape the world around them into something else, something dangerous. Are we supposed to just walk away from it? Lisa's voice was sharp with disbelief. Just ignore everything it shows us? You heard it too, right? What the figure, whatever it was, said about transcending? How are we supposed to ignore that? The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, moving slowly toward the window, his hand brushing the thick frost that had gathered on the glass. He stared out into the storm, his face a mask of contemplation. Beth could feel the weight of his silence, and though she didn't understand why, she knew he wasn't simply avoiding the question. He was thinking, weighing something. When he finally spoke again, his voice was distant, almost as if he were speaking to himself. The mountain offers transcendence, yes, but at a cost. It does not offer true freedom, only the illusion of it. And the price for that freedom is always higher than you think. The choice may seem simple, but the consequences are not. He turned back to them, his eyes filled with a kind of solemn understanding. It will offer you salvation, but at the expense of your soul. A piece of you, the part that makes you who you are, will be lost forever. Beth's stomach churned at the thought. She could feel it, the allure of the mountain's promise, the faint whisper at the edge of her thoughts that told her it could offer her something more, something better. But could she trust it? Could she risk giving in to the temptation, knowing what it might cost? Then what are we supposed to do? Craig's voice broke through the silence, sharp and tired. Just sit here and wait for the storm to kill us? We need a plan. We need to do something. The old man nodded slowly. You are right. Waiting will not save you, but neither will rushing blindly ahead. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the group. The key is to stay grounded. The mountain will try to pull you into its illusions, to make you think you are lost. But you are not. As long as you remember who you are, the mountain cannot control you. The words rang in Beth's ears, a lifeline in the midst of the overwhelming confusion. It was like trying to grasp at something solid in a world that was constantly shifting beneath her feet. How could they stay grounded when everything around them seemed to be shifting into something unrecognizable? Beth's eyes moved to the fire, its flickering flames a fragile reminder of warmth, of life. But even the fire seemed like an illusion, a brief comfort before it was swallowed by the dark. There had to be a way forward. There had to be. But if the mountain was as powerful as the old man claimed, how could they possibly hope to overcome it? The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the storm outside raged louder. The path ahead was obscured, the choices unclear, but one thing was certain. They had to act. Time was running out, and if they were to survive this, they had to face whatever came next together. Because the mountain, with its whispers and promises, had already begun to test them in ways they couldn't yet understand. As the storm outside intensified, its howling winds pressing against the walls of the cabin, Beth sat quietly by the window, staring out at the relentless snow. The night had grown darker, but it wasn't just the absence of light that unsettled her. It was the sense of isolation. The mountain, which had once seemed like just a place, now felt more like a living entity. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't just outside anymore. It had crept inside, into their minds, distorting everything around them. Each creak of the wood, every flicker of the fire, seemed to echo with the mountain's deep, menacing pulse. And Beth could feel it, more than ever now, a sense that reality was slipping from her grasp. The others had fallen silent after the old man's cryptic warnings. Lisa, as usual, was pacing, her eyes wide and frantic as she muttered to herself. Craig, on the other hand, had withdrawn even further, sinking into the shadows of the cabin as if trying to disappear from the overwhelming tension that seemed to permeate the air. And then there was the old man, sitting near the hearth, staring into the flames with a gaze that seemed to see beyond them, beyond the walls of the cabin, beyond the storm. His words had left an unsettling impression on Beth. Something about them resonated in a way she couldn't quite explain, like a half-remembered nightmare that lingered at the edges of her consciousness. What do you think he meant? Beth asked, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice felt too loud in the quiet, like it didn't belong. She turned to face the others, but none of them answered immediately. Lisa was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "I don't know," she said almost too quietly. "It's like he knows things he shouldn't. But how can we trust him? He's just some old man stuck out here with us." Craig scoffed from the corner, his voice bitter. "You're really questioning the only person who seems to know anything about this place?" He shook his head. "That's just like you, Lisa. Always second-guessing, always looking for an easy out. But the truth is, we don't have any options left. We're stuck in this nightmare, and we have to deal with it. I'm done waiting around for some miracle." Beth felt a pang of frustration, but she couldn't dismiss Craig's words. He was right. They had no easy answers, no escape. The mountain wasn't just an obstacle. It had become a force, bending their perception, pulling them in different directions. It was as though they were trapped in some kind of labyrinth, where each choice led only to more confusion. The idea that the mountain could distort their sense of reality, twist their thoughts and memories. It was a thought that gnawed at Beth, threatening to unravel her sanity. For a moment, she closed her eyes, trying to block out the din of their voices, trying to focus. There had to be something, some thread they could follow, some way to understand what was happening to them. But as she did, the world seemed to shift. Her thoughts twisted, not in a way that felt natural, but as if they were being guided, pushed by an unseen hand. She saw flashes of images, fragments of memories that didn't make sense. Her childhood, her family, but then something darker. A face, a voice, the old man's eyes, watching her too closely. She opened her eyes abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. The room hadn't changed, but her perception of it had. The shadows on the walls seemed longer, the flickering firelight more sinister. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. It was like the walls were closing in on her, bending in ways they shouldn't, as if reality itself were warping. "Beth!" Lisa's voice broke through the haze. "Are you okay?" Beth blinked, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaky. "It's like, I'm not sure what's real anymore." The others exchanged uneasy glances, and the old man's gaze snapped to her, sharp and knowing. "The mountain will test you," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "It will try to make you doubt yourself, your memories, your reality. It will show you things you think you know, but they will be distorted." Beth swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Was that what was happening to her? Had the mountain already begun its work? She tried to push the thought aside, but it clung to her like a shadow in the corner of her mind. She had always prided herself on being grounded, on keeping a clear head, but here, in this place, it was becoming increasingly impossible. "I don't think I can take much more of this," Craig muttered, his voice a low growl. "I'm not going to lose my mind here. Not to some mountain. I don't care what it throws at me." Lisa's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "We have to stick together," she urged. "That's what he said, remember? We have to hold on to each other, stay grounded. We can't let it tear us apart." Beth nodded absently, though a part of her wondered if it was already too late. The mountain, it seemed, didn't just warp the world around them. It had already begun to warp them. Their thoughts, their fears, their very selves. They had no choice but to keep going. But how could they move forward when the ground beneath them was shifting? "Can we trust him?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she wasn't sure who she was asking anymore. Was it the old man? Or herself? The old man's eyes never left her as he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "Trust is a fragile thing, child, but you must trust what you know in your heart. The mountain cannot control that." Beth wanted to believe him. She needed to. But the more she thought about it, the more the question lingered unanswered. Could she trust herself? Was she truly the person she thought she was? Or was that just another illusion the mountain had planted in her mind? As the storm outside raged on, Beth felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her. The path ahead was no clearer than before, but the mountain's grip was tightening, drawing them deeper into its web of confusion and fear. If they were to survive, they would need more than just hope. They would need to fight against the very fabric of reality itself. And that was a fight none of them were prepared for. The night dragged on in a suffocating silence, the cabin shrouded in the weight of secrets and unspoken fears. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but within the walls of the cabin, the atmosphere was far worse. The air was thick with an unidentifiable pressure, a sense of impending doom that clung to each of them like a second skin. They sat around the fire, their eyes flickering nervously between the shadows, as if expecting something, or someone, to leap from the darkness at any moment. But it wasn't the storm they were afraid of anymore. It was the mountain, and worse still, it was each other. Beth, for her part, could barely focus on anything for long. Her thoughts were muddled, her mind a swirling storm of images, sensations, and half-forgotten memories. The old man's words had taken root deep within her, each one echoing in the back of her mind. The mountain will test you. It will make you doubt yourself. At first, she hadn't understood what that meant. But now, as she sat there, staring into the flickering fire, she realized with a chill creeping down her spine that the mountain had already begun its work. "Do you feel it?" she asked suddenly, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. Lisa looked up startled. "Feel what?" she asked cautiously, though her expression betrayed a growing unease. Beth's fingers curled around the arm of her chair, as if to steady herself. Like we're not alone anymore. Like something is watching us. But not just from the outside, from inside too. It's like we're trapped in our own minds. Lisa's lips pressed together, and she looked away, as though trying to dismiss Beth's words. "You're just tired, that's all. We all are. This whole thing is starting to mess with our heads. I don't trust that old man, and I don't trust this place. But we'll get out of here. We have to." Beth didn't reply, but she felt the weight of Lisa's words and their hollow emptiness. They had to get out. But what if the way out was just another illusion? What if the mountain had already trapped them in a reality they couldn't escape? At that moment, the fire flickered violently, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. For a fleeting second, Beth thought she saw something. Someone standing just beyond the cabin door. But when she blinked, the shape was gone, leaving only the faintest hint of a figure in the dark. Her heart raced, and she turned quickly to the others, but they hadn't seen it. Of course they hadn't. They were too busy with their own fears, their own spiraling thoughts, just as she was. "The storm is getting worse," Craig muttered from the corner, his eyes darting nervously from one shadow to another. "Maybe we should try to make it to the old mine. At least there, we might be able to get some kind of shelter from this nightmare." Beth's stomach twisted at the thought. The old mine. It was an idea that seemed to come from nowhere, a suggestion that had no real foundation, and yet it felt like a temptation. The mountain's influence was already seeping into their decisions, bending their will, making them act on impulse. And now, with that thought, the mine, suddenly all she could hear in her head was the echo of footsteps in dark tunnels, cold stone beneath her feet, and an overwhelming sense of dread. "No," Beth said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. "The mine isn't the answer. It's just another way for the mountain to pull us deeper." The old man stirred from his corner, his eyes narrowing as he spoke in his gravelly voice. "You think the mountain gives you choices? It never does. It shows you what you need to see, not what you want to see. There is no escape. You cannot run from what's coming." Beth felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine at his words. There it was again, his cryptic, disjointed way of speaking, as if he already knew the path they would take, as if he knew the inevitable end. But how could he? How could anyone? She turned away, staring out the window. The snowstorm had turned the world outside into an impenetrable wall of white. The once majestic landscape was now an endless blur of snow and ice, a blank canvas that mocked their helplessness. It was as though the mountain had swallowed up everything in its path, leaving only this small, insignificant cabin as a testament to their existence. The thought struck her with a jolt. Was the storm merely a storm? Or was it the mountain's way of sealing them inside, of preventing them from leaving? She couldn't be sure anymore. What if the storm was only the beginning? A voice broke through her thoughts. It was Craig, but he wasn't looking at her or anyone else. He was staring at the door, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Beth's heart skipped a beat, her blood running cold. She didn't hear anything. At least, nothing that could explain the sudden unease in the air. But something was wrong. There was a shift, a presence. It was there, just beyond the door, pressing against the walls of the cabin, stretching the silence until it felt like it might snap. The door creaked, a soft groan of wood protesting the weight of something. Beth stood up, her legs unsteady as she took a cautious step toward it. The others watched her, the tension palpable in the room, but none of them dared to move. As she reached the door, her fingers hovered above the handle, but before she could touch it, a loud bang shook the cabin. The door flew open with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet, revealing nothing but swirling snow. The howling winds tore through the threshold, almost as if the mountain itself was trying to drag them out into the storm. For a moment, everything was still, and then a voice. It was soft, too soft, as if it were coming from within the walls. A whisper so faint, so distorted, that Beth could barely make out the words. "You can't escape. You never could." Her heart stopped. The mountain had spoken. It had heard her. And now, it knew she had understood. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the room fell into darkness. The fire sputtered out. In the dead silence that followed, Beth knew that the mountain's grip was tightening. There was no escape. There was no turning back. They had already crossed the point of no return. The oppressive silence that followed the door's violent slam hung heavy in the cabin. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, and in its place, an unnatural stillness gripped everything inside. The storm raged on, but now it seemed distant, faint and muted as though it no longer mattered. The mountain had made its presence known in a way no one could ignore. It wasn't just a place of snow and ice anymore. It had become something else, something alive. Beth stood frozen in the center of the room, her breath shallow and uneven. The whisper, "You can't escape. You never could," still echoed in her mind, but it wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a creeping sensation that clung to her skin and sunk into her bones. The cabin felt smaller now, as though it were shrinking around them, closing them in. No one spoke, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the suffocating weight of fear. Lisa was the first to move, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the fire poker. She glanced at Beth, her expression tight with anxiety. That wasn't just the wind, was it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Beth didn't answer right away. She didn't trust herself to speak, didn't trust the words that were forming in her head. How could she explain it? How could she put into words the strange, insidious feeling that had taken root inside her, twisting her thoughts, warping her perception? The mountain was alive. That was the only truth that mattered now, and she had no idea how to stop it from claiming them all. "Nothing out there," Craig said, standing by the door. "It's just a damn storm. We're all on edge." His voice was defensive, but even as he spoke, he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. He had seen it too, the same presence that Beth had felt. It was as if the mountain had taken a piece of their souls, feeding on their dread, their confusion. It was getting stronger. Beth turned away from him, her eyes falling on the corner where the old man sat, his gnarled hands resting on his knees. He hadn't moved since the door had slammed shut, and the strange intensity in his gaze made her skin crawl. He was waiting for something, or perhaps for nothing at all. His silence was more unnerving than any of the words he had spoken before. She couldn't help but wonder if he knew more than he had let on, if he had always known what was coming. "The mountain has a way of showing you what you need to see," the old man said suddenly, his voice low and steady. "It will twist your mind, bend your will, make you see things that aren't there. And the more you resist, the stronger it gets. You're already trapped in its grip. Don't try to fight it." Beth felt a shudder run through her. She wasn't sure if the old man was simply warning them or if he was telling them something much darker. What did he mean by "what you need to see"? Was the mountain showing them some distorted truth about themselves? Or was it manipulating them into believing things that weren't real? The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, and she suddenly felt very small, very vulnerable. Craig snorted, clearly unwilling to accept the old man's fatalistic view. "We're not going to just give up. We can still leave. We can still find a way out of here." But there was no fire in his voice anymore. It was hollow, forced. Even he knew, deep down, that escape wasn't possible. The storm was more than just the weather. The mountain had sealed them in, not with walls, but with its sheer, crushing presence. The air around them was thick with something they couldn't name, but that didn't stop it from smothering them, slowly, relentlessly. Lisa's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just wait to what? Be consumed by it." There was a hint of hysteria in her words, and Beth could feel the fear radiating off of her. She didn't blame her. Fear was the only thing that had become real here. It was the one constant, the only thing that never changed, no matter how much they tried to ignore it. "We wait," the old man replied simply, his gaze unshifting. "The mountain will show you the way, but only if you stop fighting it. It will show you what you fear the most, and then you'll understand. Only then can you leave." Beth swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in like a stone in her stomach. The idea of staying, of surrendering to the mountain, made her feel nauseous. But what other choice did they have? Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to break free, to find a way to escape. But she could feel the mountain's grip tightening around her heart, squeezing until her thoughts became disjointed, confused. "I'm not staying here," Lisa said suddenly, her voice shaking. "I'm leaving. I don't care what happens." But as she stood, a flash of movement caught Beth's eye. In the corner, where the shadows were darkest, she saw it, something that hadn't been there before. A figure, barely visible, standing as though it had always been part of the cabin's dark corners. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, but the aura of it, the presence, was unmistakable. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Beth's heart raced, and before she could speak, the figure stepped forward, as if pulled by an invisible string. The others didn't see it. They couldn't. But Beth knew. She knew it was the mountain's doing. It was showing them something they weren't meant to see. "No, you can't leave," the figure's voice whispered, distorted and cold. "You belong here now." The words were both familiar and foreign, a language that shouldn't have made sense. But in that moment, it did. It was the mountain, speaking through the figure, through the cabin, through the shadows themselves. Lisa froze, her eyes wide with terror. She could hear it too now, the low hum of the mountain's voice seeping into her mind. It was too late to turn back. Beth knew then that there was no escaping what had already begun. The mountain was not just a place. It was a presence, an ancient force that had already claimed them all. And now, it was drawing them deeper into its depths. As the figure in the corner of the room shifted into the dim light, Beth's mind reeled, unable to process what she was seeing. The shape, now more distinct, was unmistakably human in form, but its features were inconstant, shifting like smoke caught in the wind. For a moment, it looked like a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed too large for its face. Then, just as quickly, the shape morphed, becoming something else entirely, a grotesque mass of shifting shadows and elongated limbs. Beth could feel her stomach churn, her breath catching in her throat. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't of this world. It was the mountain itself, made manifest. "Get away from it," Lisa screamed, her hands trembling as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The door had been slammed shut long ago, and the windows were coated in layers of ice, no longer offering an escape. The cabin had become their prison. The walls seemed to close in with every passing second, as though the very air had turned to stone. Craig was frozen too, his face ashen, his eyes locked on the figure in the corner. "What is that?" His voice trembled, but his words felt hollow, like he was speaking to the space between them, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But the mountain's hold on them was stronger than any denial. They were past the point of reason. The figure spoke again, but this time its voice was a low, guttural growl, like something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries, clawing its way to the surface. "You have no choice. You cannot leave." This is where you belong." The words felt like a weight on Beth's chest, suffocating her, twisting her insides. It wasn't just speaking to them. It was speaking through them, as though it had already claimed their souls, one by one. Beth's heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced. She could feel the mountain pressing in on her, in every crevice of the room, in the very fibers of her being. The presence of the thing in the corner, its shifting shape, was a symbol of something far greater, a force that was too vast to comprehend, too powerful to escape. And she realized with a cold rush of horror that it wasn't just the storm outside that had trapped them here. It was something deeper. The mountain itself had claimed them. "What does it want from us?" Craig asked, his voice cracking, but there was no answer. The figure simply stood there, silent now, watching them with eyes that felt far too knowing. It wasn't concerned with explanations. It didn't need to justify itself. The mountain's will was beyond reason. It didn't want anything. It demanded. Lisa was frantic now, her movements erratic as she paced back and forth. "We need to find a way out. We can't just sit here and let it consume us." Her voice was a sharp contrast to the calm, suffocating presence in the room. Her words, though filled with desperation, had no weight. It was as if the mountain had already decided their fates. Beth's mind, already strained, struggled to find any logical way out. There was no escape. Every path, every possibility she considered, led to the same conclusion. They were trapped, and in that suffocating realization, something shifted inside her. It was a subtle change, like a flicker of light in a dark room. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge the thought, but it was there, persistent, unavoidable. The mountain had a plan for them. They weren't meant to leave. The old man, who had remained eerily silent throughout the entire ordeal, spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't fight the mountain. You can only surrender." His words cut through the air like a razor. They didn't offer comfort, only an unsettling truth. It wasn't a matter of will or strength. It was a matter of acceptance. Beth's knees nearly buckled under the weight of that truth. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was an entity, a force of nature, alive and conscious. It fed on fear, on confusion, on resistance. The more they struggled, the stronger it grew. Lisa spun toward the old man, her eyes wild. "What do you mean, surrender? Are you saying we should just give up?" Her voice trembled with a mix of fury and disbelief. The old man didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, his face weary, resigned. "Fighting it only feeds it. You'll understand soon enough. It's in the mountain. It's in all of you now. You can't escape what you've already become." Beth's skin crawled at his words. What had they become? Had they already crossed a point of no return? She could feel it now, that sense of something shifting deep within her, something twisted and wrong. The mountain's influence was creeping through her thoughts, filling her mind with dark possibilities. Every breath she took felt like a betrayal. As if on cue, the figure in the corner stirred, its form warping once again. The dark presence stretched toward them, a cold, clammy sensation sweeping through the room like a tide of ice. Beth could feel her mind slipping, her thoughts scattering as the mountain whispered in the back of her consciousness. "There's no turning back now." The words were chilling because they were true. The mountain had already claimed them, body and soul. There was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the inevitable. The days had become indistinguishable. The storm outside had escalated, turning into a violent blizzard that no one dared venture through. Within the cabin, the air grew thick and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them. Time was a mere suggestion. The hours had no meaning, no purpose. The only thing that remained was the haunting presence of the mountain. Beth had tried to convince herself that there had to be a way out, that there had to be some hope left in the world beyond the cabin. But as the hours turned to days, that hope had started to fade. It wasn't just the physical storm that had trapped them, but something far deeper, a force that had taken root in the very marrow of their bones, in their souls. The mountain wasn't just a physical place. It was a thing of the mind, a presence that twisted perception and shattered reality. The figure in the corner remained, though it had stopped shifting. Now, It stood motionless, almost as if it were waiting. But waiting for what? Beth had begun to notice the subtle changes in the others. Lisa had become quieter, her eyes wide with the distant, unblinking stare of someone who had seen too much. Craig had grown restless, pacing in tight circles, muttering to himself. And the old man, he had become something different altogether. He no longer spoke, his once feeble words replaced by the hollow stillness of someone who had already accepted their fate. The sense of resignation was palpable, and yet there was something else, a growing awareness that they were not alone in the cabin. The mountain had begun to make its presence known in ways they had never expected. Beth would hear faint whispers when no one else was speaking, voices that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. At night, she would wake in a cold sweat, her mind filled with fragmented images. Visions of dark shapes moving beneath the snow, of strange figures watching from the trees, of eyes too numerous to count. The old man had always said that they could not fight the mountain, that they could only surrender. But surrender to what? Beth wondered. To become part of the mountain? To be consumed by it? She had heard the stories from the locals about people who had disappeared over the years. People who had come to the resort only to vanish without a trace. Was this the fate that awaited them? Had they already become part of the mountain, lost to its cold, unyielding grasp? One night, as the storm raged outside, Beth ventured into the cabin's darkened hallway. She had to know, had to understand what was happening. The figure in the corner was gone now, but the air felt thick, as though the room had absorbed it, the walls themselves steeped in its presence. As her fingers brushed against the cold wood, a shudder ran through her spine. She stepped forward, drawn by something she couldn't name. It was as if the very structure of the cabin was alive, breathing, pulsating with a life of its own. A low growl echoed from deep within the mountain, reverberating through the floorboards. Beth stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind flashing with terror. The sound wasn't something outside. It came from within the earth itself. The mountain was alive, and it was waking. She ran back to the main room, but the moment she stepped over the threshold, she stopped dead in her tracks. The others were no longer in their usual places. Lisa, Craig, and even the old man had disappeared, leaving only a cold, empty space where they once sat. The room seemed wrong. The shadows were too deep, too thick. Something had shifted, something that had pulled them into the very heart of the mountain, into its depths. Beth's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it now, the pull of the mountain. It wasn't just outside. It was inside her, inside all of them. The weight of its presence was unbearable. It felt as though the mountain itself was devouring their souls, twisting their very essence into something unrecognizable. There was no escape. The world outside the cabin had ceased to exist. The mountain had claimed them, body and soul. The whispers started again, but this time, they were clearer. They weren't just distant voices anymore. They were inside her head, pushing her, pulling her, urging her to listen, to understand. You are part of the mountain now, they whispered. There is no going back. There is no outside world. You belong to us. Beth tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Her body trembled, every muscle fighting against the pull, but it was futile. The mountain's grip on her was too strong. As her vision blurred, she saw shapes in the shadows, shapes that were not human, not even close. They were the faces of the lost ones, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at her with an unspoken warning. They had become part of the mountain, just like she was. The floor beneath her feet groaned, and she realized, with a sickening certainty, that the cabin was no longer a safe haven. It was a tomb. The mountain had dug its roots deep into the earth, and now it was pulling everything into itself. Everything and everyone that had dared to come close. The walls closed in, the air growing thick and heavy as the presence in the cabin surged to a new intensity. There was no more space for denial, no more room for hope. There was only the mountain, and it was watching, waiting, ready to claim her as it had claimed so many others before. As the darkness swallowed her whole, Beth felt the cold tendrils of the mountain wrap around her, and she finally understood. There was no escape. The mountain didn't just trap you in the physical sense. It trapped your very essence, pulling you into its eternal, suffocating depths until you became nothing but a whisper on the wind, one with the mountain forever lost. The storm had not ceased. If anything, it had grown more insistent, howling against the cabin like a beast desperate to break free. But within, the silence was far more oppressive than the winds outside. The silence spoke volumes, each moment pregnant with the weight of an unseen presence that had finally settled into the bones of the place. Beth was gone, lost to the mountain in ways both tangible and unfathomable. Yet, her absence only seemed to magnify the suffocating presence that now consumed the cabin. It wasn't just the absence of a person. It was the absence of escape, the absence of hope. The cabin had become a relic, a hollow shell filled with the echoes of those who had passed through and disappeared. The walls seemed to hum with a strange vibration, a low, persistent murmur that no one could quite place. It was as if the very structure was alive with something ancient, something far older than any of them could comprehend. Every corner of the cabin, every inch of wood and stone, had become an extension of the mountain itself. The storm outside had stopped being weather. It was a reflection of something more insidious, more powerful. The mountain had long since abandoned its disguise as a mere natural force. It was a thing with a purpose, a mind of its own, and it had consumed everything. The others had not returned. There was no sign of Craig, Lisa, or the old man. The rooms were vacant, their absence suffocating the space in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. In their place, the very air seemed to carry a presence, something intangible but undeniably real. The whispers had grown louder in the silence. They came not from the walls, but from within her mind, as if the mountain had found its way inside, planting its roots deep within her thoughts. She could feel them, the lost ones, the ones who had been consumed before her, their voices wrapped around her consciousness like the cold tendrils of a forgotten dream. "We are one now," they whispered. "There is no return." But even as their words wormed their way deeper into her psyche, something else stirred within her, a recognition, a fragment of clarity. Beth was not truly gone. She had not been absorbed entirely, not yet. There was still a part of her, a tiny sliver of consciousness, that refused to give in completely. She had heard the stories, the whispered warnings of the old man and the others before her. They had said that once the mountain took you, there was no coming back, that it swallowed your soul, your will, your very essence. But something was different. The mountain, for all its ancient power, had underestimated something vital, her defiance. The storm outside raged on, but in the silence of the cabin, it felt far more like a stillness than a noise. The air was thick, charged with an eerie electricity. Beth stood in the center of the room, staring into the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to happen. There was no sign of the other figures that had once filled the cabin. There was only the darkness and the overwhelming pull of the mountain that surrounded her, inside and out. Yet, she felt an odd calmness settle over her. It was as though she had reached a point of understanding, a place where the madness of the storm could no longer touch her. The mountain had taken many things. It had taken lives, bodies, and memories. It had twisted time, distorted reality, and consumed all who had ventured too close. But it had not taken everything. It had not taken her will to fight. Perhaps it could not. Perhaps the mountain's grip was not as absolute as it had once seemed. Maybe, just maybe, she could still break free. Beth closed her eyes, feeling the pressure of the mountain closing in on her, suffocating her. She had once thought it was the end when she had first felt the pull of the mountain, when she had first understood the power that lived within it. But now she understood it differently. The mountain was not invincible. It could be resisted. It could be fought. It could be escaped. She could escape. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the whispers stopped. The cold, gnawing fear that had been her constant companion since that first night in the cabin ebbed away, leaving only a quiet certainty. The mountain could not have her. Not fully. It could not claim her as it had others. There was a place within her, a place the mountain could never touch. It had underestimated her defiance, just as it had underestimated the power of those it had consumed before her. Beth turned and walked to the door. The wind howled louder now, but it no longer held the same terror. It was a storm, yes, but it was not the end. With every step she took toward the door, the weight in her chest lifted. The mountain, in its arrogance, had believed it could take everything, but it had missed one thing: her will to survive. It could consume her body, but it would not consume her soul. Not today. The door opened with a groan, and Beth stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit her immediately, but it was a welcome feeling, alive, real. As she stepped forward, she realized that the mountain had not fully embraced her as it had thought. Its grip had loosened, its power faded. The storm outside was still fierce, but it no longer seemed like the end. It was a beginning, a new chapter. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in days, she felt something she hadn't felt since that first terrifying moment: freedom. The mountain had failed, and in that failure, it had left her stronger than before. As she stepped into the whiteout, the storm still swirling around her, Beth knew one undeniable truth: she had survived, and nothing would ever take that from her.